I'll be honest with you, a few years back, I was in my shop cranking out a bookcase, pocket holes everywhere, yellow glue on every joint, and I was feeling pretty good about myself. Finished it in a weekend. Then I started reading about the old European carpenter guilds, the ones that operated from roughly the 12th century through the 16th century across England, France, and Germany, and I came across something that stopped me cold. These guilds had actual rules written into their charters about how work had to be built, and if a journeyman carpenter got caught using the kinds of shortcuts I was using on that bookcase, he wouldn't just get a talking to, he'd be fined. Repeat it, and he'd be expelled. His career would be over. That got my attention. So I started digging deeper into what these guilds actually required and why, and I realized that at least 10 things most of us do in a modern shop without thinking twice would have gotten us thrown out on our ears. Today I'm going to walk you through all 10 of them, what the guild expected instead, and why those old rules still make more sense than most of us want to admit. Plus, stick around to the end, because I'll show you a layout method I picked up from studying guild-era work that completely changed how I approach joinery. Let's get into it. Medieval carpenter guilds weren't just trade organizations. They were the quality control system for an entire civilization's built environment. When a guild put its reputation behind a piece of work, that work had to last. Not 5 years, not 20, generations. And these weren't abstract ideals. They were enforced through apprenticeship systems that lasted 7 years or more, through inspections by master craftsmen, and through penalties that could destroy a man's livelihood. The guilds operated across Europe, but some of the best documented traditions come from the English livery companies, the French compagnonnage system, and the German Zunft guilds. Each had slightly different structures, but they shared a common philosophy. The material is sacred. The joint is everything, and your work speaks for you long after you're gone. A master carpenter in 14th century Rouen or 15th century London wasn't building for a customer's weekend. He was building for that customer's grandchildren. And every decision he made, from how he selected his timber to how he finished his surfaces, reflected that long view. When I understood that, I started seeing my own habits in a very different light. So here's number one, and it's the big one: relying on pocket holes instead of proper joinery. Now look, I'm not here to tell you pocket holes have no place in woodworking. They're fast, they're easy, and for certain utility projects, they do the job. But in a medieval guild shop, a pocket hole would have been unthinkable for any piece of furniture or structural work. The guild standard was mortise and tenon for frames, dovetails for carcasses, and housed joints for shelving. Every joint was expected to derive its strength from the geometry of the wood itself, not from a fastener hiding inside a drilled pocket. The reasoning was simple. A pocket screw relies on thread grip in end grain, which is the weakest possible holding scenario in wood. A proper mortise and tenon relies on long grain to long grain contact, glue surface, and mechanical lock. When I finally started replacing pocket holes with even simple stub tenons on my face frames, the difference in rigidity was immediately obvious. The guild masters knew that 800 years ago. Number two, using rigid glues where they don't belong. Most of us reach for yellow glue or even polyurethane glue for everything. And modern PVA glue is remarkable stuff, stronger than the wood itself in many cases. But that strength is exactly the problem in certain applications. Medieval craftsmen used hide glue almost exclusively. Not because they didn't have alternatives, they had fish, glue, casein glue, and various plant-based adhesives, but because hide glue has a property that rigid modern glues don't. It's reversible. You can apply heat and moisture and take a joint apart cleanly, decades or even centuries later. The guilds understood that furniture lives in changing environments. Wood moves. Joints need maintenance over a lifetime. A glue that locks everything rigid and permanent means that when something eventually needs repair, you're more likely to destroy the piece than fix it. I started keeping a pot of hide glue warm in my shop about 3 years ago, and the first time I had to repair a joint I'd assembled with it, I understood instantly why the old craftsmen insisted on it. Number three, ignoring grain direction. This one hit me hard because I realized I'd been doing it for years without thinking. Most of us look at a board and see dimensions: length, width, thickness. Is it big enough for the part I need? Medieval guild craftsmen looked at a board and saw behavior. They studied how the grain ran, where the cathedral patterns fell, which face was the heart side and which was the sap side. and they oriented every single part based on how that wood would move over time. A tabletop with all boards cupped in the same direction will warp as a unit. Alternate the growth rings and it stays flatter. Run your grain the wrong direction through a leg, and it's weak where it needs to be strong. The guilds taught this during apprenticeship as foundational knowledge before a young man was ever allowed to cut a joint. When I started paying real attention to grain orientation, parts that used to give me trouble just started behaving. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Number 4. Skipping the layout and cutting to measurement alone. Here's something that surprised me. Guild-era craftsmen didn't rely heavily on measuring. They relied on marking. There's a critical difference. When you measure with a tape and transfer a number, every single transfer introduces a chance for error. What the old craftsmen did instead was use dividers, marking gauges, and story sticks to transfer dimensions directly from one piece to another. No numbers involved. The joint is marked from the joint, not from a ruler. I used to think this was primitive. Then I tried it on a set of dining chairs where I needed 8 identical mortises. Using direct transfer from a story stick, every single one came out dead consistent. More consistent than I'd ever achieved measuring each one individually with a tape. The guilds required this approach because inconsistency in joinery was considered a mark of incompetence. Number 5. Using screws as structural joinery. Walk into most modern shops, and you'll see screws doing the heavy lifting in everything from table aprons to cabinet backs. A guild craftsman would look at that and see a joint waiting to fail. Screws in wood are subject to withdrawal forces, vibration loosening, and corrosion. A drawboard mortise and tenon, which was the guild standard for structural frames, uses a wooden peg offset slightly so it physically pulls the tenon into the mortise as it's driven home. No metal, no threads, just a mechanical lock that actually tightens with age as the wood compresses around the peg. I started drawbering my workbench joints about 4 years ago, and those joints are tighter today than the day I made them. Number 6. Sanding instead of planing final surfaces. This one changed my shop more than almost anything else. Most of us sand our way through the grits to get a smooth surface. The guild approach was to use a finely tuned smoothing plane for the final surface, no sandpaper at all. And the results are genuinely different. Sandpaper tears and scratches wood fibers at a microscopic level, which is why sanded surfaces sometimes look muddy under a finish. A sharp plane severs the fibers cleanly, leaving a surface that reflects light and accepts finish in a way sanded wood simply cannot match. When I planed the top of a cherry table instead of sanding it and applied the first coat of oil, the chatoyance, that shimmer you see in well-finished cherry, was unlike anything I'd gotten before. The guild masters weren't being fussy. They understood the physics of light on wood. Number 7. Building without allowing for wood movement. If there's one thing that separates guild-era work from modern production furniture, it's this. Every single joint, every panel, every attachment point in guild-era construction accounted for the fact that wood expands and contracts across the grain with changes in humidity. A solid panel sits in a groove with room to move. A tabletop is attached with buttons or slotted cleats. Nothing is rigidly fixed across the grain. Most modern furniture ignores this entirely, and that's why you see cracked panels, popped joints, and split tops on pieces that are only a few years old. When I started designing every project with seasonal movement in mind, calculated at roughly 1/8 of an inch per 12 inches of width for most hardwoods, my furniture stopped self-destructing. Number 8. Reaching for the router before thinking through the joint. The router is probably the most versatile power tool in a modern shop, and I love mine. But I noticed something when studying guild-era methods. When every joint is cut by hand, you think about that joint much more carefully before you commit. You consider whether it's the right joint for the application. A router makes it easy to cut the same profile over and over without stopping to ask whether a different approach would be stronger or more appropriate. Guild apprentices were taught to select the joint based on the forces it would experience, not based on which jig was already set up. That mental discipline, choosing the joint before choosing the tool, made my work noticeably better. Number 9, treating finishing as an afterthought. Most of us build the piece and then figure out the finish at the end. Medieval craftsmen planned the finish from the beginning because it affected decisions all the way through construction. If you're going to use an oil finish, your surface preparation matters more because oil reveals every flaw. If you're using a film finish, your wood selection matters because some species don't accept it well. The guilds treated finishing as an integral part of the craft, not a separate step. Finishes were made in the shop from linseed, oil, beeswax, and natural resins, and they were applied in thin coats built up over days. When I started planning my finish before I made my first cut, my completed project started looking fundamentally more cohesive. Number 10. Building for today instead of building for decades. This is the one that ties everything together. Every shortcut on this list exists because modern woodworking culture prioritizes speed and immediate results. And I get it. We have limited shop time, families, jobs, and 100 other demands. But the guild philosophy was different. They believed the time you invest in doing it right is always less than the time someone will eventually spend fixing what you did wrong. When I started approaching each project as something that should outlast me, every decision in the shop got clearer. Not slower necessarily, just more deliberate. And the work got better in ways I didn't expect. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one comes directly from studying guild-era layout practices, and it's changed how I approach every mortise and tenon joint I cut. Instead of measuring the width of my mortise with a ruler and then setting a marking gauge to that number, I set my marking gauge directly from the chisel I'm going to use to chop the mortise. If I'm using a 3/8-inch chisel, I set the gauge pins to exactly the width of that chisel by pressing them against the flat of the blade. Then I scribe my lines. This means the mortise width is guaranteed to match the chisel perfectly. No measuring error, no conversion mistakes. The tenon is then scribed to match the mortise using the same gauge at the same setting. I learned this from studying a description of a 15th century German guild training manual, and the first time I tried it, my tenons fit straight from the saw with almost no paring needed. It takes about 30 seconds, and it eliminates the most common source of sloppy fitting joinery. Simple, old, and it works. Every single time. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Lost Workshop. 17 chapters of medieval hand tool techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with 33 illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.